communication link between New York and Tel Aviv was needed desperately. And obviously it had to be a secret one, or the British Palestine administration immediately would clamp down on all this activity. The link was provided by two American Jews recently discharged from the United States World War II forces, the brothers Herman and Reuben Gross. In July 1969, I interviewed Herman Gross in his home in Great Neck, New York. A few days later, I traveled to Staten Island and interviewed Reuben Gross, who now lived in Israel but happened to be in New York on a visit to his children and grandchildren, and I recorded his version. Here, then, is the story of the underground radio link, New York and Tel Aviv, as told by Herman and Reuben Gross. For Herman Gross, it began this way.
I'm Herman Gross. I live in Great Neck now. Back in 1947, my brother Reuben lived in Staten Island, and at that time the two of us were involved in handling the communication underground between the Jewish agency in New York and the Haganah in Israel, or what was then, of course, Palestine. My brother and I both are amateur radio operators. His call then was W2OXR, my call was W2YHO, and I had a rather complete amateur radio station in my home on Staten Island. I had built it myself. I had been a radar officer during World War II in the Navy and had picked up the technique, and all during my years in the Navy, I dreamed of building a big amateur station, which I promptly did as soon as I got out of the Navy, and set it up in a room in my house.
For Reuben Gross, it began earlier.
But it all started, I believe, back in 1946. I had shortly been discharged from service in World War II by the United States Army. I had served in the ETO in France and Luxembourg and in Germany. I developed some skill at the use of Morse code and acquired more knowledge than I had had before as to the elements of electricity and electronics. And after being discharged from the Army, I managed to get an amateur radio operator's license, largely because of the training which I had received. It was one evening in my home in 46, after reading a book about the work that the Haganah had done in World War II with parachutists to Europe and in other rescue missions to save a few Jews here and there while they were being killed wholesale, and being rather overwrought by the unsympathetic attitude that the world was showing to the survivors of the Holocaust, that I was pacing the floor trying to think of what I could do, if anything, to help save the last remnant. And it was then that I realized and tried to place myself in the position of someone trying to do this work on a general level, that I thought that they might need some kind of communications, and I believe that communications between representatives here in New York and in Palestine would be needed. I therefore asked a few friends who were connected with the Jewish agency and close to Zionist work whether they knew where and how I could meet someone who could give me more information on this. I ultimately wound up at the Jewish agency and was directed to meet a certain party who, it turned out, was ultimately the commander of the Israeli forces in the war of liberation. At that time, his name was Dostoevsky. He ultimately changed his name to Dory. But he was quite busy, and I didn't get in to see him directly, but spoke to a woman whose name was originally Rogozhnikov, but was then using the name of Rogers, Minna Rogers. She later became the first commander of the Chen, the Chel Nashim, the women's defense forces. I told her what my desire was, and of course, before they would give me any answer, I found out that they had me checked out very thoroughly to see that I was reliable insofar as interest in Zionist causes was concerned. And after having been cleared and checked, I was asked to make a few test transmissions, and reports came back that I was heard very well, first in Paris and then in Tel Aviv. I was also told that if I wished, I could hear transmissions that were being sent out by an underground station in Tel Aviv. These transmissions were on 6 megacycles, 666 kilocycles, and generally around 8 o'clock in the evening. I listened, and hearing a station that came from a Jewish underground in a day when Jews had no political power or influence was very thrilling.
Reuben promptly drew his brother Herman into this undertaking.
One day, Rube came to me and told me that he was requested by the people of the Jewish Agency to set up a radio contact with Tel Aviv for the purpose of handling confidential or secret information. And he suggested that we use my station. He had one too, but mine was bigger and more powerful. Of course, we leaped at the opportunity to do something like this.
Now both brothers were involved. They were ready to proceed. Reuben takes up the story.
Ultimately, I got ready and was prepared to send messages. I was told that my messages should be sent as was being done by the station in Tel Aviv. Send your message, repeating every word twice, and then at the end of the whole thing, repeat the whole message. This was to help if a word was missed.
They worked as a team. Herman tells us,
Rube, who was a better code or dot and dash operator than I am, always handled the key. Communication was done by dot and dash rather than by voice, because when you speak on the airwaves, the whole world is listening.
Their work was not without some misadventures. Reuben tells of this.
Unfortunately, as it happened, sometimes because of the peculiarities of the fist of the Morse operator, the same words seemed to be missed the second, third, and fourth time, and would sometimes mean the loss of the message. In those cases, they had to send coded telegrams, which would get there the following day, and then the message would be repeated again, and sometimes it was unfortunate the same word tended to be lost again. Accordingly, I demanded that if this thing was to work properly, we would have to develop normal two-way communications. Even though the station there worked somewhat outside the bands I was permitted to transmit on, yet we managed to maintain a kind of communication. One day I got ready to send, and I stated I was there, and asked them to respond. They did not respond. I again sent out a signal and demanded that they respond. Hearing no response, since we were not prepared at that time for two-way communications, I closed down with the notice that I would be on the following night. The following night, I sent out my signal, and to my great thrill, my hair actually stood on end. I shall never forget the moment when I came back with the long series of V's and an R indicating that I had been received, and we then, from that time on, it was in about February or March 1947, until September 3rd, 1947, I would transmit and receive traffic, 3 or 4 telegrams a night each way, on an average, 3 nights a week until the curfews, which I believe were in June or July, when many of the Jewish leaders were placed in encampment at Atlit. At that time, because of the curfew and the breakdown of all communications, I was kept busy as many as 5 nights a week, and sometimes on rather lengthy messages.
Herman Gross takes up the narrative.
A messenger would come from New York every day with pages and pages of coded messages. Neither Reuben nor I ever knew what the content was, and it's just as well that we didn't. We would try to establish contact with our counterpart in Tel Aviv. Most of the time we were able to do it without difficulty. There were times when radio conditions were not good and we were unable to. In order to throw off any suspicion as to what we were doing, we used a SV9 CD, I believe it was, which is the prefix of the island of Crete. And they would come back with the prefix PA0 CD, which is the prefix of a Dutch call. We wanted to eliminate any possibility that anyone would realize that we were transmitting to Palestine. We operated for about 6 months during 1947, from April to September 47, I believe, with transmissions most every night of the week, sometimes going up to 2, even 3 hours. We would send our traffic, we would copy it down, we would deliver the messages received to the messenger, who in turn would hand over the next day's messages. This, to remind you, was the time of the Exodus. It was the time of the Irgun. It was the time when the British threw most of the Haganah and agency members into the Athlet detention camp. They were very trying times, and it was a time when the Haganah was trying to raise arms, was trying to get word about money, was trying to find out about ships, and I surmise that most of this traffic had to do with those matters.
They used an ingenious scheme. Reuben Gross
messages were encoded. By that I mean not only did they come in Morse code, but the message as written down by me was in just 5-letter groups, which spelled sheer nonsense. They were turned over to a messenger who took them to a decoder, who then put them into Hebrew and Hebrew letters, and then decoded them into a message which came out in Hebrew. I was never informed as to the precise content of these messages, except that once